I want to talk about the late, great Raymond Berry here. Few people could do a better job of talking about the late, great Raymond Berry than the late, great Frank DeFord, who shared a little bit about Raymond Berry when the NFL did their greatest players of all time a few years ago. This is from NFL Films' Frank DeFord on Raymond Berry.
I suppose Raymond Berry was the hero to everybody who wasn't very athletic. Berry just didn't look like a football player. And of course, he was blind as a bat. Had not had a particularly distinguished career at SMU. Was not particularly fast. But the most important thing with Berry were these things.
When it comes to pass catching, here's the man they'll never replace. His name is Raymond Berry, and he has the surest hands in football.
His ability to catch a football and to hang on to it. We have that vision of him laid out. That's Raymond Berry. Laid out, going out of bounds, catching the damn thing.
Yeah, that's Frank DeFord, remembering the incredible Raymond Berry. And, of course, we just lost Frank a couple years ago as well. Joining us now here on GCR to talk a little bit more about the life and legacy of the great Raymond Berry. I learned a lot about Raymond Berry from my own father. Look, I have to acknowledge openly, I am 42 years old. I did not get to watch Raymond Berry play football in his career. I learned a lot from my own father, but I learned even more when I read our next guest's book, The Best Game Ever, Giants versus Colts, 1958, which was, of course, about the 1958 NFL championship game, the greatest game ever played, but it was so much about the people that were involved and their stories. Joining us now, he is the author of that book, along with a number of other incredible books. He is Mark Bowden, and he is with us here on Glenn Clark Radio. Mark, it's Glenn in Baltimore. It's great to chat with you, sir. Thank you so much for taking the time for us.
Sure, it's my pleasure, Glenn.
Mark, it really jumped out at me in reading what you wrote about Raymond Berry that I don't think it's funny now. All we ever talk about is how much quarterbacks are getting together with their receivers. But I don't know that people realize that in this era of football, it was like earth-shattering, the idea that John Unitas and Raymond Berry would, after practice, just go spend all this time working together on the field away from football practice. And how much of an impact. You heard Frank DeFord say maybe Raymond Berry wasn't the greatest athlete and didn't have the greatest career, but it seemed like there was a pretty direct translation between these guys and the time that they spent together and the greatness of the two of them together.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it speaks well of both of them. They both made the most of the talent they had. And, you know, in Raymond's case, I really think he was the driver behind that. I mean, he made himself into a great football player as much with his mind as he could with his body. And, you know, he was a thoroughly dedicated athlete. You know, when I went to meet him working on that book, I had been interviewing players. And remember, I was asking them about a game that had been played 50 years before. And I said to Raymond, you may not have much of a detailed memory of this particular game. He says, "Oh, I do." I went down to his office, and he had a 3-ring binder, well worn, for every year he played in the NFL, and in each binder were his meticulous pregame and postgame notes, where he would map out what strategies he had for whatever cornerback or safety was likely to be covering him, and what he was going to do in every given situation. That was one of the things he did. So when he spoke to me about that game, he was referring to detailed notes about everything that happened in it before and after.
What's wild to me as you describe that, Mark, is that I think a lot of people now in 2025 or 2026, sorry, I keep forgetting where we are, would say, right, well, that's, everybody's got that. This is the 1950s that we're talking about.
Now every player in the NFL has a position coach
right,
who can work with him to prepare and specifically for opponents that they're going to face, and who then does a post-game briefing. And don't forget, Glenn, now everybody has access to film, and they can study, what the opposing team is doing, what opposing players are doing. They can figure out moves that they think would be effective against this player or that player. Back in 1958, Raymond was really one of the first football players to study film, and he did it with Johnny Unitas. They would borrow, the team got game film, but individual players never studied film, except Raymond did. And Raymond, all those notes that he took prior to a game came out of hours of detailed study of the film. And remember, he has to thread the film into a projector and project it up against the wall, and none of the tools that people have today. As I wrote about in The Best Game Ever, he really made himself into a great football player.
He is Mark Bowden, and he is with us here on Glenn Clark Radio as we remember Raymond Berry, who passed away last week. It's interesting because the way you're describing it, like I wonder, and I didn't think about it at the time when I read the book, but is there an argument to be made that like Raymond Berry made John Unitas as much as John Unitas may have made Raymond Berry? Like, we talk about John Unitas as being one of the greatest quarterbacks in the history of football. We don't really talk about Raymond Berry that way, but is there an argument that without one there isn't the other?
I think that's true. I think they made each other better. I think any serious evaluation of Unitas' career has to consider the contribution that Raymond made, and not just to John Unitas, but to the Colts team. I mean, I love the story about how, Weeb Eubank used to send in plays to, he'd change personnel and they'd send a player running out of the field, and he'd tell the offensive players in the huddle, okay, Weeb wants us to run this play next. And that happened one time, and Raymond looked at Unitas and said, that's not going to work. So they ran a different play than the one Weeb had sent in. And Weeb was furious, even though apparently the play was successful. And he asked Unitas, why didn't you run the play I sent in? And he said, Raymond said it wouldn't work. And that was good enough for Weeb, because he knew Raymond knew what he was talking about.
What an unbelievable amount of faith to have. That's really incredible.
I know. Well, then, it's not at all surprising that Raymond went on to become a great coach.
Right.
And coached the Patriots to the Super Bowl. So, I mean, he is, in my mind, and there may be others that, that I haven't looked at as carefully, but certainly one of the prototypes of the modern football player.
It's interesting, Mark, because again, Frank DeFord. I'll listen to Frank DeFord talk about anything, right? But like in that clip, he talks about Raymond not being the most athletic. But I remember you writing about like how he also focused on that. Like he focused on trying to be as conditioned or really even like muscular as he possibly could in making the transition to the NFL.
He did, and it wasn't just preparing himself physically. Think about this for a minute. Raymond broke down the hand positions that you would be in to catch a football. I mean, there's a different hand position if the football comes over your left shoulder, comes over your right shoulder, if it comes to your midsection, if it comes to the lower left or the lower right. You have your hands in different positions. And he would have Unitas throw him passes to every one of those positions repetitively, standing against like a soccer goal with a net behind it so they didn't lose all the footballs, but do like maybe 20 repetitions of every hand position that he would use every day. And so when he got into a football game, this was just instinctive for him.
This is wild. In a way, it really feels like what you're describing is almost like a revolutionizing football, right? Like that Raymond Berry, in so many ways, we don't call it analytics necessarily, but what he did almost seems like foreshadowing to what the game would become and to stockpile as much information as you possibly can have.
Absolutely. With the NFL is such a terrifically competitive environment that if a team has success, like the Colts had in the late 1950s, other teams looked very hard at what are they doing differently? What can we do that they're doing? And this whole notion of film study for individual players I haven't made a study of it, but I guarantee you that became a common practice for professional football players right away after 1958, 59, 1960. Coaches caught on to it. The technology improved, and it became part of how you prepared to play the game.
Mark, is there an argument, too, about what it did just for passing the ball in the NFL? I feel like that's another part of this conversation that we all know how much more the ball is thrown in the modern era of football, but, like, how much of that maybe can we relate to John Unitas, Raymond Berry, and that connection they had and the amount of time they spent working on it?
Well, their success was definitely a result of the amount of time that they prepared and practiced. But, that was part of the whole revolution of the pro game in the late 1950s. Is the passing game emerged as the primary means of attack. And, it just grew more and more sophisticated. In that 1958 game, for instance, they were playing against the New York Giants, whose defensive coordinator was Tom Landry, who invented these more sophisticated pass defenses that have evolved, ever since. So, he invented the role basically of a middle linebacker because they needed a player who could both rush and tackle, but also drop back and cover if somebody was uncovered coming out of the backfield. So, that there's no mystery why Tom Landry went on and created a dynasty in Dallas. And there's no mystery to why Weeb Ewbank and the Colts were as successful as they were. They were on to something new.
Can you I'm not going to ask you to try to do a math equation to create the odds, but I'm thinking about Raymond Berry, 20th round draft pick, John Unitas, 9th round draft pick. The likelihood that these two humans together were going to change the course of football as we knew it. Can you possibly come up with a way to define that, Mark?
Well, it certainly does transcend their skills because they had to have an attitude of, being willing to put in the extra work and of learning from each other. A guy like Johnny Unitas, who's had a fair amount of success, granted that he didn't have it overnight, but by the time 1958, 56, 57 rolled around, he was already at the top of his game. And yet he was willing to listen to this guy who wore glasses and, who showed up and wasn't the fastest guy on the field. But he said, look, if we do this, we'll be better. We'll have an advantage. And Unitas was willing to do that. And Berry was just born with it. Obviously, when I met him years later, the fact, just looking at the notebooks that he kept all these years, it shows you what a kind of a meticulously careful personality he had. He was very deliberate about everything he did. And, that personality is what really, I think, certainly helped, if not won the game in 1958 championship, but made Unitas and the team as good as they were.
I'm so appreciative of you sharing this, right? Because I just feel like there are so many people of a certain age that maybe remember Raymond Berry as the coach, as you brought up, who led the Patriots to the Super Bowl before losing to the Bears, but don't understand, like, it not just a great player, but truly changed so much about football. And the impact that he has and the legacy that he has, I think, goes so far beyond just being a successful and Hall of Fame caliber player.
Yeah, they were revolution agents in the game of football, right at a time when the NFL was just beginning to take off. That game in 1958, which was the equivalent of the Super Bowl, was played in Yankee Stadium because there weren't football stadiums everywhere. There was baseball stadiums, and it was the off season. It didn't even sell out. And within 2 years, there was a rival league. Johnny Unitas I think he was paid $18,000 to play in 1958. And within 2 or 3 years, Joe Namath got a $100,000 bonus just to sign with the New York Jets. So it shows how the league took off. And it was because of television, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that game went into overtime, the first game ever in overtime in the NFL, and it spilled over into prime time on television and got an audience of millions, and people just were hooked.
Oh, it was it's such a thrill. If you have not read Mark's book, I cannot encourage it enough. I was still in my 20s at the point where I read it, and it taught me so much about the history of Baltimore football and the Baltimore Colts. We'll link it up on our Twitter account as well, at Glenn Clark Radio. The best game ever, Giants versus Colts, 1958. If you haven't read it, I couldn't encourage it more strongly. Mark Bowden, is there anything that we can plug for you? We really appreciate you taking the time for us.
No, I'm kind of retired, enjoying watching sports on TV and not writing a whole lot right now. I would add one more thing.
Yeah.
When I wrote that book, The Best Game Ever, Andy Reid was kind enough to sit down and go over that game film with me, play by play by play, sitting in his office. And my understanding of what was happening on the field is informed throughout that book by Andy Reid's insights. And it was also fascinating to hear him talk about, watching the formations on the field, the fact that defenses lined up the same way every play. He said in his lifetime as a coach, he had never seen that happen.
Wow.
and the fact, that he would pick certain players who he felt, might be able to still play in the NFL today. One of them was Unitas, but that most of them would never stand a chance of playing in the game as it's played today.
Probably the case. Probably the case. Mark Bowden, thank you so much for taking the time for us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Glenn. But happy to talk about Raymond. He's one of the amazing ones.
I might be reaching out to you again for WBAL Radio. I'll be in touch, Mark. Thank you so much.
All right, Glenn. Bye-bye.
Mark Bowden with us here on GCR with phenomenal insight. I mean, really phenomenal insight. And I'm telling you, man, I've read a lot of sports books in my life based on what we do, and that book might be the best book I've ever read. I mean, it's an unbelievable, in-depth dive into the game, into the stories of the players, and on both sides, right? Because you think about those 1958 Giants and Sam Huff, and all of the legendary Pat Summerall, right? I think there were 17 future Hall of Famers, if I remember correctly, between the players and the coaches. Frank Gifford, of course, was on that Giants team. It's an incredible read.